The oak leaves and acorns are something that leatherworkers use quite a bit as a motif on carvings, and you can even find patterns for them in the form of craftaids. Craftaids are very useful, and that's what I used in this case. Basically, it's a plastic sheet, and it's got a raised ridge on it in the shape of the pattern. So you can just lay that down on a wet piece of leather and rub it with the spoon of a modeling tool and transfer your pattern directly into the leather and sort of jump right to the fun part of actually carving. Patterns where you don't have an access to something like a Craftaids, you can get books of patterns for wood carving or even sometimes for leatherworking. This one is particular for leatherworking, though it's not in print anymore. And it's just full of roses and oak leaves. And you can take those and trace them with some plastic tracing film. Sometimes I've heard it called vellum. It's like a mylar film that's somewhat clear. It's like using tracing paper basically, but it doesn't dissolve when it gets onto the wet leather. Now, I've always liked carving oak leaves and acorns on things, and I think they're a great way to practice and get better with the swivel knife. There's a lot of little sharp cuts and corners, little tight turns that are involved in carving them. And as I said, they are traditional to leatherworkers. You'll probably notice, if you're around leather very much at all, that the word oak keeps popping up all over the place. Tandy's brands of leather are live oak and craftsman oak. There's a tannery in St. Louis called Herman Oak, which is actually where this particular piece of leather came from. They've been there for a long time and make some very nice carving leather. And the reason that oak keeps popping up is that vegetable tan leather uses oak leaves and bark as a source of tannic acid, as a source of tannins that are used to preserve the hides. So it really is actually an instrumental part of the leather. And since natural patterns like leaves and flowers are commonly used by leatherworkers, it just sort of makes sense that they would use oak leaves. A lot of these cuts that are on the outside, you go full depth on these. Now, at least full depth, I mean you can go up to halfway through your leather. I'm probably not even going that deep through it because this is a pretty thick piece of leather. But these cuts where there's these fold backs, these are supposed to taper off. So you're actually supposed to cut deep to start with, and as you come up, it should taper off to nothing, would be the proper way to do those. And that'll make your leaf look like it's still attached on this end and just rolled. And that's the goal you're going for here. And I do all the leaf and all the stem usually before I do the acorns, which is probably a little backwards. You should probably do the acorns first because you probably should stick to the rule of foremost first. Whatever's in front you should cut first and carve first. And when I get to the beveling and actually with the stamps and everything, I will do that. But I like to carve all the leaves with the swivel knife first and then sort of fill in with the acorns. I'm not always keen on the shape of acorns that are used in some carving patterns, so I'll sometimes alter them a little bit with the swivel knife as I go. This particular one isn't too bad, but this is another cut you want to do. A little light between the cap and the actual acorn. It doesn't quite stand out as much as it does from the background. But I'm going to make these acorns just a little bit fatter. A little chunkier acorns than what this carving pattern has. And there we go. We're going to go ahead and do a little bit of this next leaf. But anyway, now that I've got a couple of those cut, I'm going to go ahead and grab some of the tools I'll need to stamp them. And really for this, you don't need all of these different tools, though some of them are useful. Mostly you're going to need a pear shader that's, in this case, a long thin one, and I'm using a textured one. You can use a smooth one. I've grabbed another pear shader just in case I find an area that I think is a little bit thicker that I'm going to need that. I don't think I will. And then you'll need a couple bevelers, probably a fairly medium-sized one and a smaller one, narrower one. So you can see the difference between these two. And then I always like to use a pointed beveler as well. Not many places on this that'll need that, but like in these corners, I'll need to use a pointed beveler to get up into those. And I grabbed a really tiny beveler and a really wide one just in case I come up with a place that I need those. But anyway, for the most part, this pear shader, you can tilt it and just do toe impressions to get into some of those spots. And you can kind of move it around, roll it around a little bit as needed. And what we're doing is we're just trying to give some lively shape to that leaf. We're kind of making the leaf look like it's rolled and moved, some waves in it, rather than just a straight flat object. I'm sort of fading in some of those harder corners. Once we have that, we can go ahead and go to our bevelers. And for down the vein, I'm going to go ahead and use that big beveler that I found. From then on, our smaller bevelers are going to be mostly what we're going to use. These little turnbacks of the leaves, just like when you're cutting, you want to taper off your cut up in this point. You want to taper off your beveling as well. So I started very lightly and then I worked my way into it and worked a little bit deeper as I went. One of the problems with working with a belt is that the end of the belt wants to hang off your work surface, and that causes this part to bounce a little bit too much, which can make it difficult. I'm using a sandbag up here to hold this end, but then this end wobbles and moves around. It can be helpful to have two sandbags, one holding on each side, to hold it in place. You wouldn't be able to see what I was doing then if I did that. So that's one of the ways that a camera can get in the way of actually doing a easier way of doing this. If you can get your workpiece to kind of stay down on your work surface, it makes a big difference on how well your beveler will walk along inside the cuts. If it's bouncing too much, it just moves up and down with the beveler, and the beveler itself won't move along. It'll just kind of like want to try and stay in one spot. And all those tight corners are why I think oak leaves are a great thing to carve if you want to get better at carving. But of course, the best thing to carve if you want to get better at carving is whatever you want to carve. You're going to be better off trying to do something that you want the finished product and that's what you're interested in, than just carving something just to be carving and just to be practicing. And as I've mentioned in other videos about carving, always watch these points that you go past all the points and you make sure that you get those beveled really well, because that's going to make a difference. And back in these corners, all these little tighter corners, this will just kind of blur in and it makes it look like this is still part of the background. But if you get into those tighter corners with a beveler and manage to push those down, it all of a sudden will make your whole carving look like it stands out more. Because your brain subconsciously picks up on those parts being attached to the background and turns it all into one layer. And if you can make shadows in those parts, then all of a sudden your brain turns it into that's a separate piece sitting on top of the other layer. Now, little side veins on the leaves, there's several different ways you can do these. They can be cut in with a swivel knife. You can bevel them the same way as you did the vein down the center. Or you could just take and just sort of draw them in with a modeling tool. And depending on what I particularly feel like at that day, I could go real complicated with these veins, or I could just draw something in real quick, either with the swivel knife or with the corner modeling spoon like this. Should probably be doing the other side of those. I think the modeling tool is probably the most lifelike looking way of putting them on. But all of the above are options. But that's pretty much the oak leaf. The only thing I would add to it is on all of these turnbacks, again, you take your modeling tool and just round those out a little bit. And those will look more lifelike. Again, if the back of that is round, it looks like the leaf rolled over. And so now we got the shadow here and the rolled over outside. And it really makes the leaf look like it's standing out as something that's turned over. So then we get to the acorns. And acorns, being part of those pattern as well, and the stems. The stems are pretty easy, just bevel them. The acorns, we're going to bevel them, and then we got to put that cross hatching in that's in an acorn. And I'll do that with the swivel knife, which is a little bit of a tricky thing to do. But first we have to bevel them. Alright, on the part where the cap meets the acorn, I don't want to bevel very deep, so I'm just actually going to take by hand and not even hit it with the mallet. I'm just going to take that beveler in there and just sort of lay it in and wiggle it around a little bit, just to give myself a little bit of definition there. Now again, acorns are rounded, so if you take your modeling tool and round out those bevels just a little bit, they'll look better, as they'll look more like they're a round surface. And the same with the cap. And the final step on this particular acorn is taking a swivel knife and putting in those cross hatches. And I do that just kind of a curved line, not much of a curve, just a little bit, and sort of diagonal across the cap. I'll do a whole bunch of little parallel lines. Then I'll turn my piece and I'll do the same thing, running perpendicular to them. That takes quite a bit of control with the swivel knife to do an acorn cap like that. Again, I think it's really good practice. There's also ways to cheat. There are actually stamps you can buy that are acorns that you just sit in place and whack it with a mallet and you've got an acorn stamp there. If you're beginning, that's a good way to go. I personally like everyone to look a little different so people can tell, hey, that was hand carved in there. But it's a lot more work to do it this way than to just go, boom, I've got an acorn. Whichever you want to do. Now, the disadvantage of just using a stamp is you can't do things like this where the acorns are covering one over the other. So it limits your patterns a little bit. But you could easily alter this pattern to where this acorn stuck out a little bit more and just use a stamp on it. Now, I'm going to finish up these stems and this other acorn. Don't forget those pointed bevelers to get back into these corners and really make stuff stand out the way that it should. And I'm going to go ahead and use a backgrounder, like just a basic, this is a 104 backgrounder, just in all these little corners and back in here, and just sort of fade it out a little bit, kind of fill in these areas and just make everything stand out a little bit better. And there we go. That's how I carve oak leaves and acorns onto quite a few different projects, actually, but in a belt in this case. Now I just have a whole bunch more to carve.